Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. This is part one of Planting Trees to Save the World with Maximo Bottaro. Maximo is the co-founder of an NGO called ReForest Now. They grow and plant trees and educate people about the importance of forests and biodiversity. In this episode, you'll hear how they obtained a partnership with Ecosia. You'll hear him explain the relationship between the decrease in rainfall, the decrease in biodiversity, bushfires, and climate change. You'll hear him explain how to plant a forest the right way, the difference between weeds and native species, what is conversion evolution, and other solutions to climate change. Dear listeners, it's not always easy to get clear on what we can actually do to help this world, how we can impact. This is why I've created a cheat sheet, your 10 superpowers to change the world right now. You can download it on www.futureseeds.news/superpowers.
Started with Greenpeace, went to Rainforest Rescue, then spent a long time at university doing science degrees and genetics research into rainforest, and then worked in Rainforest Trust, and then one day just went, with a guy I'd been working with for over 10 years, Michael Martin, the co-founder. We just said, let's just do it. Let's just do our own thing, uninhibited, get the most outcome, just start our own thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so today, ReForest Now, I believe, does tree growing, tree planting, bush regeneration, has a nursery that's about 1 hectare.
Yeah.
Has donors in 40 countries.
Probably a bit more now, yeah.
And is already considered as a medium-sized charity, even though you were born in 2018. And you have 16 staff. You want to tell us about your staff?
Yeah, well, look, the staffing's really broad. So, we do everything in-house, and I think that is why we're a medium-sized charity already in just 2 years. I mean, that's from the registration. That's from the high hopes. No logo or anything yet. It's from that point. So what we did that I think was smart was kind of simple. We just did everything ourselves. So we've got our own social media, our own grant writers, our own scientists, our own seed collectors, nursery people, builders, tree planters, rainforest regenerators, just everything, administration. We do everything ourselves. So that's allowed us to employ a lot of people, and that is ultimately the goal of ReForest Now, is to employ a lot of people, because everything else is beyond that, beyond getting a lot of people.
Do you also have a lot of volunteers who work with you?
Well, we had heaps, We had at least 20 a week in the nursery, and we had over 100 coming to plantings. But look, after COVID, we just thought it's too messy to get back into volunteerism now. So we've just left it. And one positive of that is that it's been able to create more stable employment for people, which is it's like an obsession of mine, is how to create more stable employment for people.
Absolutely. I think it must have paid off to have a really good team, because I heard that you had a partnership with Ecosia, the search engine at the moment.
Yeah, I think what happened there was they heard about the bushfires in Australia. They hadn't ever had a project here.
Right.
Never done that. And I think they were looking at organisations, and they just liked the look of us, and they contacted us. And I think Ecosia is really savvy on the science, and they're also savvy on the dishonesty that can occur in any large-scale industry, including tree planting. So I think that they'd seen people that, were taking money and not actually doing what they said they were doing, and so on. So they looked at the way that we ran our organisation, which is like aggressively honest. Like every little thing we do, we say where it is, what GPS, what polygon, who it was for. Not many people are doing that. So I think that's why we got Ecosia.
Right, you're referencing data strongly.
Yeah, obsessively, because if I go to a big tree planting company's website, I often can't see a single tree where it was planted, and I'm like, how are you getting millions of dollars? You're not accounting for anything.
Right.
We account for everything.
Okay, beautiful. So without further ado, this is what I'm going to discuss in this interview. As every Future Seeds interview, we discuss the problems and then we discuss the solutions. We want to talk about the bushfires in Australia, of course. I want to talk about loss in biodiversity. I want to talk about global warming. I want to talk about decrease in rainfall.
Got a bit to say about that one. Yeah.
Yeah, because I watched your video on the bacteria and the bioprecipitation. We'll be talking about that.
Yeah.
But first, maybe a quick summary of those issues, what you'd have to say about all those issues. First of all, are they related? Are they linked?
Yep. Yes. Sure, other things feed into them, but yeah, they're all linked. And we could do that one by one if you're interested. Or
Yeah, let's start with the decrease in rainfall then.
how is it linked to?
Bushfires, global warming, loss in biodiversity.
Oh, right. Well, if you get reduced rainfall, it's easier for fire to start, right?
Yeah.
So that's what happened to us in 2019. Rainforest that normally is able to maintain its own microclimate because of the canopy and the soil, everything about rainforest is fire protective. The vines stop the wind coming in. The moist forest floor, it's like the darkest forest floor of any forest type is rainforest. So it's moist. So even if embers are flicked in from bushfires far away, they might not even get through the canopy.
Right.
And if they do, they're not going to light in the dark in the wet leaves, where it's cold and wet. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons why the forest doesn't burn. At least half the species have complex biological responses to fire that stop them from burning or from being completely killed, or the timber is, in at least half cases of species type, the timber is not really effective at lighting and staying lit and passing the fire on and so on, and creating that flash, that power that spreads it. So there's that. Loss of biodiversity is always going to happen when you have wildfires, ravaging around. I mean, I think, I've heard from several organisations in the last, say, 6 months who've been trying to find out if their endangered species is now going to go extinct or if half of them are missing or so on. So the bushfires are definitely a threat to biodiversity. In the Australian landscape, bushfires have contracted the presence of rainforest. But you imagine, in the Australian landscape, the rainforest is in all sorts of funny shapes based on mountains where it's going to catch the wet air rising off the ocean and rain and so on. So the rainforest was in all strange shapes around the landscape. And if you just imagine it with your, digitally in your mind, you just imagine it contracting. If it has this odd shape, they can contract and break apart just from the Australian burning of the forest, the eucalyptus forest. So then you end up with these fragmented patches, and then they're going to get burnt all the way around the edge when they're fragmented off. So when the fire ecosystem is going to spread into there, and then when it burns, it's going to burn from all sides and continue to crush those remnants. So, we've lost a lot of remnants that way, but yeah, continue, please.
And finally, global warming, is it linked to all this?
Directly. Yeah, directly. The thing to remember about global warming that's been said continuously since 1991, when Carl Sagan first presented, to world-leading scientists, long before it was really believed by anybody. And I remember, because I was campaigning against global warming in 2001 in Melbourne, and I remember talking to thousands of people who didn't believe it. So back in 1991, they knew well back then that the thing that you shouldn't forget is that climate change is going to cause more extreme weather. So that could be hot, that could be cold, that could be hurricanes, but it's just going to be, a less stable Earth. And that's, I think, what people often forget. Neil deGrasse Tyson said it like this. He said, climate, following what's happening with the climate is like a man and a dog walking on the beach. The dog is going to wave left and right, and you're going to say, oh, but it's colder than usual this month. Maybe climate change isn't real. The dog's going to wander on the leash, but watch the trend. And the trend is that there's more extreme weather events. So, what happened in 2019? No, not normal. Not normal at all. We meant to get 1,800 millimetres of rain a year. We got 770 or something. It's completely insane. We should never have anything like that.
The decrease in rainfall all over the territory. I remember going to a conference here by Will Steffen, and he was explaining how the currents change in the ocean. And because of that, it's raining in the ocean now rather than raining in the big farming belt in south of Australia. Is that also a contributing factor?
Yeah, we should have a pen. Okay, so there's 3 things to think of there. One is, if you look at the NOAA website and you look at their heat maps of rainfall over the Earth, the Amazon's being deforested aggressively and has been for some decades, right? There's a belt of rainfall that comes off the Amazon and it heads southeast, and that rains across the bottom of WA and across South Australia into Tasmania and Victoria. You can actually see it spraying this jet of water across the earth and then down to Antarctica. So first of all, that's reducing. The other one is that deforestation was measured as far back as the 1980s in Victoria, and determined to be reducing the rainfall at that time by 18%. So they already knew 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, that deforestation in Australia was reducing the rainfall, and they kept logging it, reducing the total cover. Now, in terms of weather systems, their behaviour, the reason the ocean changes so much is because when you heat up the Earth, the ocean first responds by absorbing some of that water. It's just the chemistry and the physics of the process is the ocean takes the first hit and it heats up. So that's why we've had really serious career science, climate science people have looked at the ocean, and that's where they've been getting a lot of their data, saying, hey, stop worrying about air temperature or surface temperature, look at the ocean heating up. And when the ocean heats up, all of these belts that we understand that travel around the Earth, through the Earth's oceans for thousands of years, they're going to change their behavior.
So much so that when we actually speak about trying to limit the increase of temperature on the planet to, let's say, 2 degrees, it's increasing it by far more in the ocean, isn't it?
Oh, well, I'd have to check the figures, but the way to say it, that I'm confident to say it, is the ocean will change more significantly before the rest of the planet does, and those effects are going to be very hard to come back from, because we live on a planet where we understand a lot of the paleology, the ancient history of the place, and our oceans have been pretty toxic in the past, and if we don't want to go back there, because if the oceans start to change, if they get too acidic and too hot.
What do you mean by in the past?
Well, going back 1.5 billion years.
Right.
So the Earth's 3/4 of its history, you didn't want to be in the ocean, put it that way. Basically, I would really be concerned if the ocean had a runaway effect. Yeah, and that would bother me more than what's happening on the surface.
Right. All right. With all of this happy information, let's move to the solutions.
Yeah.
All right. Let's start with tree growing and tree planting. That seems to be a solution that a lot of organizations and a lot of countries in the world are attracted to. And I'd like to hear from you why and all of that. But there is, from what I understand, tree planting the right way and tree planting the wrong way.
The right way is to collect from enough parent trees per species so that you don't get inbreeding. So the simple way to think of it is we know what inbreeding does in humans in just one generation of it. Brother and sister, the genetics effect to the child. Trees are DNA based. Humans are DNA based. We're eukaryotic, they're eukaryotic. We are symbiotic with mitochondria, they're symbiotic with mitochondria. There's plenty in common. And it's a simple way to just understand that if people go and do large-scale reforestation and they don't collect enough genetic diversity, they'll plant 1 million trees that are all from a couple of parent trees. They're all going to be brother and sister, so to speak. And it looks fine, and they'll grow big and healthy, and then they pollinate, right? And then they breed, and the second generation of trees are going to come up, and they're all going to be of, they may, if the gene pool has some problems in it, which it probably does, if it used to be a very big species with a lot of numbers, if it's contracted down, like a lot of things on the earth have been, all those brother and sister trees are going to breed, and then you're going to have genetic problems, and they're going to get worse in the F2 generation, as in the next generation and the next generation. So some things will go extinct because of the way we're doing it. We're going to send them extinct ourselves. There's a lot to say on this topic, so I've written a book on it, and so I'll probably skip that now. If anyone wants to see more on that, there's a whole
let's
book.
just try and say.
All right, go on.
Let's just try and say. How do you plant a good forest? I know this concept of spacing of species, different species, layering. having microorganisms in there for regenerating the soil, mulch for against evaporating. What can you tell us?
Oh, and this more basic, in the more summary. So, to look at what's going to be able to reclaim the landscape from what was already there. So not to use eucalyptus to take the Himalayas, to look at let's say a rainforest hill that goes into a creek, and say, okay, we're going to plant a mix of things to reclaim this hill. It's a bit drier than the trees that would have liked to have lived there before when it was forested. It's going to need slightly drier tolerant species to reclaim it, and more pioneers. So basically when you plant a forest, you've got to have pioneers that are fast growing, fast fruiting, fast dying. And then there's what's called early secondaries, which are, a bit slower growing, a bit slower fruiting, a bit bigger, and they might live for 50 years or something. And then there's late secondaries, and then mature phase. And at the mature phase end, you're talking about trees that could live for 800 years.
So when you're planting a forest, you've got to be present for all those three phases and introducing new species.
What we do is we go in first. We put in a mix of all four.
All right.
So we'll put maybe 30% pioneers to make sure that they come up quickly and make a canopy to shade out the grass and to support the other trees. And then, so there'll be a mix of all four. So there won't be too many mature phase because they're not very helpful with building a forest. They need, 10 years before they're going to be anything interesting. You got me? So we put that mix in. We put some shrubs in. Shrubs are important. A lot of bush regenerators don't bother, but they're important because if you have like this big bunching lamandra grass, you've got to think about all the insects that are going to live there and, the shading of the soil layer and so on. So you think there is so much biological activity that can happen if the soil isn't being cooked by the sun all the time. Because first of all, the sun sterilizes everything because it's got UV. You can kill Ebola with the sun.
Kill a what?
Ebola.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You kill HIV with the sun. Like, it's powerful, right? It's putting out UV and worse. So, as much as you can bring back some layers is best, but you don't put vines into a regenerating forest. You put them into one that's maybe 10 years old and with a consistent canopy. Because if there's breaks in the canopy, you're going to kill it with vines because they'll just climb up, cover the whole tree and kill it. So the vines we bring in later, we tend to plant vines for endangered species, primarily for like pink underwing moths and birdwing, Richmond birdwing butterflies and so on. Some shrubs. We definitely think it's important to use shrubs that retain banks and so on, and think of shrubs that feed the native birds. We do something a bit unusual, which is we drill our holes for our trees down about this deep. So, what's that, like 40 centimeters? And then we basically make up a goo with water crystals. So this is basically a chemical that absorbs water and holds it for a long time. And we put more than this. We put 600 mils in the bottom of a hole, and inside it, it's clear jelly, right? Like this. And inside it, there's just fertilizer just sitting inside, suspended in it, and it's slow release. So we put that right down the bottom of the hole. We put some of the stem of the tree in the hole so that the roots are below the level of the weeds.
Yeah.
So because the roots of the weeds are up here, so we want our roots down there. So it's colder, so it's wetter and colder, and they're not competing with the weeds so much. So we put our tree in the ground with a little bit of the stem inside the ground because they don't care. Rainforest trees don't care they're not going to rot.
Yeah.
So they're in deeper, they're going to get a better start. They've got this reservoir of wet stuff. And then every time it rains, that wet stuff rehydrates and they're just drinking all the time. They grow really fast. We've got trees in 6 months that are over 1 metre tall, which is just 6 months since they were planted from the nursery. So it's really effective to bury them deep, have the stuff down there. And every time it rains and the jelly swells up again, the slow release fertilizers we use leaks a bit more out when it rehydrates. So it only gives the tree fertilizer when it's wet. So they're not getting fertilizer when they're just trying to hold on and survive in the dry.
Yeah.
So it's like the right timing. Mulching we do if it's affordable, but we're trying to do this cheaply. We're doing rainforest at $5 a tree. The landowner almost never pays for that, but we're trying to bring the price right down and do it at a bigger scale because the industry standard is something like $10 a tree in this area, and it can be as much as 25 or 30. And if you want to plant out hectares, you can't do that. So we also try to automate the whole process by having four-wheel drives moving through the site. So all the plants, the pot never leaves the car, the trailer. We're potting them, tapping them off, putting them in buckets. People are putting them straight in the holes. The crystals and the jelly and the fertilizer, that's all coming straight off trailers and vehicles. All the machinery that drills the holes, it's mounted on the vehicles, taken off, put back on. So we basically move through, get it done really efficiently, and we've been able to do a lot more work by doing it based on vehicles rather than having people trekking around all over the place.
Right. How many trees have you planted to this day?
Well, 45,600.
In this area?
In this, 10,000 in the Daintree, more or less.
In the Daintree forest, all right.
Yeah, so between the Atherton Tablelands, Mossman, Myallo, Daintree, Cape Tribulation, across all of that, 10,000 up there.
And Daintree must be a different type of tree, I imagine.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? It's 10 times the diversity of trees. So we've got 290 tree and shrub species. The Daintree has 3,000. But you see a lot of the same stuff.
That's another thing. Like, I was listening to this podcast, and they were saying, well, the guy's actually called Shubhendu Sharma, he does a lot of work in India. He's big over there. And he's saying, like, they have about 2,800 types of trees in India, but most people doing bush regeneration and tree planting over there only plant about 100 of those species. He was saying there's a bit lack in the diversity of the trees planted.
Look, I mean, in the grand scale of what I've heard, that's pretty good.
Is it?
Yeah. Like we, in the Daintree, we probably plant, 120 species in one planting. So maybe 200 out of 2,000. Because the forest is so intact, it's going to put them back anyway. It's so easy to reforest in the Daintree. You don't really have to do anything. Just put up a tarp maybe, Yes. But down here we plant most of the 290 species. Most of them.
That's pretty good.
The problem is that there's a hell of a lot of projects that only plant 5 or 10. That's bad.
Yeah, okay. So he's planted this beautiful forest, and he was talking about global warming. He said just outside the forest it was 43 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
Inside the forest, 28.
Yeah.
Just a few meters inside the forest, just at the entrance, it was already 28 degrees.
Yeah.
So planting trees as a solution to global warming.
Look, it's the easiest of all the solutions because the public will isn't there to shift over to nuclear fission. As in nuclear we already have, not the nuclear we're developing. So nobody wants to do that, and that would have been the easiest way to cut down carbon. The next one is planting trees is basically putting the earth back the way it was would theoretically fix the balance of what's in the atmosphere and the ocean and the earth and put everything back in harmony. So that is a big part of what we need to do is put all the forest back as much as we can. The earth took, you've got to remember, from the development of terrestrial life, so less than 400 million years ago, and when our ancestors came onto the ground, to the earth, the Acanthosteris, the 7-fingered fish that could wobble its way up on there, and then there was a species that could lay on the land. So in that time, that less than 400 million years, the earth has changed a lot and stabilized, and it's stabilized by where the weather is distributed, where the forests are distributed, how the atmosphere is balanced with gases and carbon and so on, and what's happened in the ocean. Like, the earth is stabilized by biology, and that's happened in our cycle. We're part of a cycle of the earth, and it's done a whole lot of crazy stuff before. The earth's been a violent, dangerous place for billions of years, and now we're in this relative period of peace. So putting the forest back will help restore that peace. But this is the next stage, it's not enough to do that or to consider a better fuel source like nuclear fusion, which is the much better option. It's not enough to do any of this because we've now pumped all these fossil fuels into the atmosphere that aren't in any of that equation I just talked about. You put all the forest back, you've still got all this crap in the atmosphere because it was buried for a very long time.
Which is why people are talking about carbon sequestration now.
BECCS technologies, yeah. We've got to figure out a way to get it out of the atmosphere. First of all, finding ways to capture carbon out of industry and pumping it underground so it never goes up. We have to do that. But then we've also got to do some crazy space age technology to get it out of the atmosphere. So planting trees won't be enough to do all of that. It'll be enough to do some of that. That's a bit scary because what we're going to have to do as a species based on the technology we have now is basically we're going to have to look at our population's use of resources per person. We're going to have to reforest as much as we can. We're going to have to consider an alternate fuel system because wind and solar aren't going to cut it unless we really control the way people live, and geothermal and so on. We really would have to change everything. So unless we're going to use one of the nuclears, we're going to have to look at what the population does with power. So I don't mean the number of people, I mean the number of people times the number of power each person uses. Yeah, so you're going to have to play with that.
If everyone lived like, I think like an American, we need 4 planets. As a Victorian, we need 6 planets, something like that.
Yeah, well, Australia's concrete is a big problem with our carbon footprint. But so you've got all of those issues. Now, the way I see it is if we're lucky, we'll do as much of all of that right as possible, slow down climate change, and then hopefully it doesn't go too wild on the planet and freak us out too much. But hopefully, if we do all of those things somewhat right, somewhere down the line, we'll find a way to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere and the methane. The methane worries me a lot more because, each molecule of methane is 23 times more heat creating for the Earth than each molecule of carbon.
Right.
And it has a short half-life, but I reckon we could find a way to knock the methane out of the atmosphere. That'd be a good start.
Is methane mainly from cows?
I don't know what ratio of it in the atmosphere comes from cows, but I imagine it's significant. But I imagine that there's also melting permafrosts. So across the north of the planet, across those ancient forests that have been frozen for thousands of years, all of that permafrost is melting and that decomposing plant materials releasing methane into the atmosphere. Very scary, right? So we can't stop that. We could reduce the amount of cows we have, but industry produces tons of methane as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So, I'm not exactly sure what the ratio is between industry and cows, but they're both things we're going to have to work on. That's, I think, the most immediate threat is to... first, there's so much we can do from all those things we talked about. Then we can try to figure out a way to immediately cut the methane out of the atmosphere. That'd be a very good move.
It would. Let's move into biodiversity, because I know you wrote a big resource on endangered species. Let's talk about biodiversity of plants and animals, and then segue into bush regeneration. So biodiversity, first of all, why is it so important to protect biodiversity?
We don't really understand ecology. We talk about it a bit, but we don't. That's for AI to figure out. Humans haven't really got that one under control. We understand biology pretty well, which is, this organ system, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. We kind of got that figured out. Ecology's way harder to study. It's like, the frog that has the fungus on its back legs that lives in that swamp, and that fungus is the only way that this orchid can germinate because it does something to the seed, and that orchid does this, has this pollen that attracts this. Ecology is a really nasty topic.
Right.
So if you lose your biodiversity, you might lose some chains in your web of life. And you lose a chain that you might have no idea that it does anything, and you might lose a bunch of species.
Like,
and then
we understand losing bees. That's one thing we're like, whoa, this is going to be a big problem.
That's the simplest.
Yeah.
But there's going to be worse stuff than that. As in less visible and hard hitting.
I apologize for my ignorance, but how do you classify a weed, and how do you classify a native species?
Oh, this is a great topic. Well, put it this way, for a start, about half of all the Australian rainforest stuff isn't from Gondwana, right? Gondwana, the continent before Australia, like what we came from. About half of the species in our rainforest came from the Indo-Malaysian forests. And you can tell, by the way, they look completely different. They got like, a lot of them have wider timber and way bigger leaves. They're from tropical rainforest. They've come down to us. So, you know, a whole lot of that stuff's not native. Native when they
That's
integrated.
what I'm asking. What is there a threshold, or what is it?
Oh man, I mean, the threshold is before Europeans got here. That's it.
Okay.
That's the threshold.
Right.
Before people started studying it. But look, there's other parameters to consider. If something comes from overseas, does it spread to huge numbers and push other things out of the habitat? Is it toxic to wildlife here, or is it toxic to horses and cattle more so? Because that's what they're more worried about when they say something's a weed.
Okay.
They go, oh, that's a weed because it kills horses, it makes them sick, you know. Then, but look, then you got species that naturalize. So there are species that come from maybe a different part of Australia or maybe from overseas, and they just integrate into the forest and don't cause trouble. So an example of that is Schliflera actinophylla. It's called the umbrella tree. It's got these big, beautiful spreads of red fruit. Came from the Mossman Gorge in North Queensland. It's down here. It lives in perfect harmony with the forest here. But people still kill it because it's a weed. But I'm telling you, in over a decade of working around it, there's nothing wrong with that species being here, and it came from North Queensland. So
the lines are blurry, definitely, between native species, weed, or good plant.
they're conservative. The lines are conservative.
Okay.
Yeah. Because if it stuffs up, you could get camphor, you know. You don't know which species is going to become camphor or which one's going to become lantana.
What's the issue with camphor?
Well, it's a complicated one, but it's not all bad. But camphor came from China. They planted a couple of them in a few places, and then now it's, if you get in a helicopter, like I did a few months ago, it's all you can see from the sky.
Right.
Yeah. You know, it's yeah.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Australia's interesting for that. I'm not from Australia, so I've discovered a lot of interesting issues here. Like the first time that I heard that cats were not welcome here, which is I guess it's the case everywhere. They kill a lot, but I've never heard it like here in Australia, where people keep their cats inside because they will kill native animals.
Yeah.
So I've never even really paid attention to the distinction between native and not native, having been brought up in France.
Well, that's a really simple example.
Yeah.
There's a thing that happens in nature called convergent evolution. So in different ecosystems, there's going to basically be some amount of similarity in the structure. You know, like a forest is a forest, so to speak, right? And in many different places, you'll get something like a dog evolve. And we don't know most of the names of them because we live in Australia, but there's all sorts of things like dogs in different forests around the world. And there's all sorts of things like cats or types of cats in forests around the world. Problem with Australia is that its evolution was cut off from the rest of the world for a very long time. Particularly for the animals. So the ecosystem here was very vulnerable to a feline being brought into it. So it had evolved completely differently to many other forest types around the world that had those. We had a dog-like creature, yeah. We had a thylacine, which was outcompeted by a brother of convergent evolution. You know, like the dingo or the dog. Like,
yeah.
So it's basically when evolution makes the same kind of thing and puts it in different places. It's really interesting that it does it so much. But Australia was not ready for cats. Not the way the birds live, not the way anything lives. They weren't ready, yeah.
Just an hour from here, you can get a $50,000 fine for having a rabbit.
Yeah, well, there's another one that Australia wasn't ready for, you know.
Dear listeners, it's not always easy to get clear on what we can actually do to help this world, how we can impact. This is why I've created a cheat sheet, your 10 superpowers to change the world right now. You can download it on www.futureseeds.news/superpowers.
The Future Seeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the Future Seeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.